Hello, my friends. Thanks for joining me once again for this edition of the History of Christianity. Today we're on part 24. We're going to be looking at Augustine once again. This is a continuation from part 23. Last week we looked at Augustine's early life. We looked at his road to his conversion. He took a very difficult road. And then we looked briefly at his work as a minister and talked about some of the important influence that he's had on the Western Church. In fact, it's been said that Augustine is the most influential theologian on the Western Church since the Apostle Paul. Because of that, we needed to take some time to really look at some of the works that Augustine wrote. We didn't have enough time to do that last week, so today we're going to be looking at the important works of Augustine. To start with, many of Augustine's first works were attempts to refute the Manichees. If you remember from last week, or if you haven't listened to that, I would encourage you to go back and listen to it. The Manichees were the first group that Augustine fell in with. So it's not really surprising that he would go after this group first because they were an important part of his life. And he had left a bunch of people behind in that group now that he considered them to be incorrect. He wanted to try to help some of his friends that were still a part of this religion. So Augustine started his work by attempting to refute the Manichees. These works dealt with the authority of Scripture, the origin of evil, and free will. The Manichees believed that everything was predetermined and that humans had no freedom. Augustine wrote against these views. He became the champion of the freedom of the will. According to him, human freedom is such that it is its own cause. When we act freely, we are not moved by something inside or outside of us, but rather by our own free will. Only that which we decide out of our own will, and not out of circumstances or out of inner necessity, is properly called free. This was important in solving the difficulties with the origin of evil. Augustine believed that there is only one God whose goodness is infinite. The existence of evil is explained by affirming that the will is created by God and is therefore good, but it is capable of making its own decisions. The origin of evil is to be found in the bad decisions made by both human and angelic wills. This was Augustine's answer to the Manichees about their teaching that everything's predetermined, there is no will, there is no human freedom really of thought or making decisions. It's all predetermined. It's all going to happen the way that it's determined that it would happen. Augustine, originally he went along with that, but now he's come out of that. And he understands that's not correct. And he wants to try to refute this, to answer the ones who had been influential on him, but also to help those who he had left behind, that he felt like were still under this teaching that is not correct. The rundown is that he really here strongly encourages the belief in free will. Now, later on, we're going to look at some of his beliefs about salvation and conversion, and you're going to start questioning this because you're going to think, wait a minute, it doesn't really sound like those views match up with what he's saying here about free will. But it does in his way of thinking. When we get to that point, it'll be easier to explain it. But for now, he's explaining to these Manichees that they're incorrect about their ideas about free will. He is asserting that human beings do have free will and that they can properly make a free choice, although it doesn't always happen that way. There are choices that we make that are not free choices. There are choices that we make freely within boundaries. Again, it'll be easier to understand that as we go along. But this thinking helped explain the origin of evil for Augustine, and it helped him to be able to accept that a good God would be able to create a creation that actually had some bad things about it. The way that he explained that is the fact of God creating people, even angelic beings, with a free will, with the capacity to be able to make both the good decisions and bad decisions. And so the origin of evil is very easy to explain then. It's just that some of the creation that God has made, that he gave this capacity to choose, made bad decisions, and therefore evil came into existence. Evil came into the creation as a result of that. Then Augustine had to deal with Donatism. If you don't remember what Donatism is, basically it's the idea of how to deal with those who lapsed. During the time when the church was being persecuted, those who did not stand up to the test, who renounced their faith or in some way didn't face the trial of persecution in the correct way, how do you bring them back into the church if they want to be brought back? If you would like to go back and kind of do a little refresher, we talked about this extensively in part 15. If you want to look for episode 15, you can go back and get a little refresher on Donatism if you would like to do that. But the important thing to know about this is Donatism centered in North Africa. So Augustine's in North Africa. He's in Hippo. So he's going to have to deal with this. He had to deal with various issues raised by the Donatists really throughout his whole career. One was the question of whether ordinations conferred by unworthy bishops were valid. Obviously, for the Donatists, they would have said no. If the man's not worthy, then the act's not worthy. It doesn't matter about the person. It doesn't matter about the one who got baptized or who is taking the Lord's Supper. So it doesn't matter about you. It matters about the person who's doing it. If they're not worthy, then it doesn't count. Augustine didn't agree with this. Augustine responded that the validity of any rite of the church does not depend on the moral virtue of the person administering it. And this is a pretty important distinction. Even today, there's questions about this. When you see a minister who is morally incorrect or has sinned in some way, who has violated the trust of people, many of them have to then leave the church that they're a part of, no longer in ministry. Some of them move along and kind of hide within the system. What about the things that they've done? Are they valid? The Donatists would have said no. Augustine said yes, because the biggest way of answering this is if that is the criteria, if you have to rely on the worthiness of another human being, you would never know for sure whether any of this was valid, because nobody knows the man's heart. If the minister, the priest, or the reverend, or whoever it is, if the person that baptized you, it comes out later that they were involved in some kind of a terrible sin in their life, well, then you could say, well, that wasn't valid, I need to do it again. But what if it's just what if it's a sin that doesn't come out? What if they don't get caught? You would live your whole life and not know whether these things were ever valid. When the Lord's Supper is being partaken of, what if that person that is administering that, what if they have an evil thought in their mind, or what if they've done something bad? You would never really know for sure. In their mind, in the mind of Augustine and the church that was against Donatism, that was just not really a valid way to go about looking at life. You just really could never know. And it would not be proper biblically to look at it that way. There's nothing really that you can point to in Scripture that would say that. So they went against it. Augustine was on the side of the Orthodox Church in being against Donatism. Augustine also dealt with the Donatists when it came to violence and war. And from this interaction, Augustine developed his theory of the just war. Again, if you'll remember, the Donatists were not above using violence to try to enforce what they thought, and they actually had armies that would go in and they would attack other churches. It happened more than one time. And Augustine is dealing with this. He knows that what they're doing is not correct. It shouldn't be there. And so he develops this theory of what is a just war? When is it okay for you as a Christian to go into armed conflict with someone, to react in a violent way? Is there ever a time that it's okay? And if so, what's the criteria for that? And that's what Augustine developed as a result of dealing with that same question with the Donatists. So we know that some of the Donatists had turned to violence. Augustine came to the conclusion that a war may be just, but only under certain conditions. So he said, there are times where it's okay to react violently. There are times that a Christian can go into armed conflict. A big question even now. There are definitely conscientious objectors all throughout our world that are Christians that would never get in any kind of armed conflict with anybody. They would never want to be in any kind of violent confrontation. They would not choose to be involved in military service as a result of their thinking here. Augustine didn't believe that. He thought that you could, but there were certain conditions that had to be met. The first is that the purpose of the war must be just. Now, when you start thinking about these things in a practical way, most groups that go to war think their war is just. So ultimately, what makes a war just? It's kind of ambiguous. It kind of is up to the people involved. And again, to the victors go the spoils, and they also get to determine history. They also get to write history. So that's kind of a tough one. It's one of those that sounds good on paper, but who really determines that? Your own conscience, the state, The military what? In a practical sense, it's kind of hard to have that as a criteria just because it's hard to know who makes that choice. But again, it is logical and it would be correct. And I guess if you're going by your own personal conscience, you can understand it that way. But what actually makes a war just? Ultimately, God. But how do we know what God thinks about it? Second condition is that a war must be waged by properly instituted authority. This is another problem. Basically, Augustine is saying that the state is always correct. Well, think about the American Revolution. When you have a group of colonists who openly rebel against the state in order to assert the rights that they feel that they should have, in Augustine's mind, those colonists would be incorrect because they're not the properly instituted authority. They're not the group that was in government. That's very problematic. It's very problematic through the years when you deal with injustice that sometimes is sanctioned by the state. When is it okay to have a violent reaction to that? Again, Augustine would have been against the American Revolution, according to this. In his mind, that would not have been a just war. Obviously, we probably disagree with that. And then the third rule is that even in the midst of violence, the motive of love must be central. Once again, don't have a lot of time to get into that. That one looks really weird. How's my motive of love going to lead me to fight somebody? Well, you can think about maybe you're in a war, then you're trying to free someone that's being oppressed. Or maybe the war is about protecting your own people, and so your love is for your people. Or maybe even if it's a religious thing, you're on the side of God, and because your love for God, you want to protect the teachings and what the practices of what God has said is correct. So you can understand it a little bit, but again, it's just kind of a weird concept probably for us, the just war. Maybe not. Maybe you look at it and think that it seems perfectly legitimate. To me, I don't know that it really is. But in Augustine's mind, it did justify that there were times that armed conflict was okay for a Christian to be involved in, but definitely what the Donatists were doing was not one of them. They were going up not in any of the right purpose of mind. Their war was not just because what they believed was incorrect, and they were not the properly instituted authority. For Augustine, that would have been the church. The church was correct. And so you take that then and think about what's coming for the Catholic Church as it gains more and more power. If you have the teaching and the belief that the properly instituted authority is the highest levels of the church, then the Protestant Reformation becomes a big problem. Now, that wasn't largely a physical armed conflict, although it did come to that in places and at times. But even just resistance to the authority at all, you can see from Augustine's way of thinking, would have been incorrect. So when it comes to this idea of the just war, it was very influential and yet probably pretty flawed, at least in my opinion. Augustine had another group that he had to deal with as well, and that was the Pelagians. Pelagius was a monk from Britain who saw the Christian life as a constant effort to overcome one's sins and attain salvation. Augustine didn't go along with this whatsoever. Now, Pelagius was probably, at least for the time, the strongest proponent of free will. We already looked at Augustine being a big proponent for free will when he was dealing with the Manichees. But Pelagius took it to a different level. He really took this human free will idea to the extreme. He believed that human beings always have the ability to overcome their sin. We come into the world with complete freedom to sin or not to sin. There is no original sin or corruption of human nature until a person freely chooses to sin. So the idea is here, when we're looking at basic Christian theology, is that a person born after the fall of Adam and Eve is already born into a sin nature. There's already original sin that's laid at their doorstep, and we don't have the capacity to live a sinless life. It's not just that eventually we came to the point that, like Adam and Eve, we willingly chose to sin and we fell from grace because of that. We fell from good standing with God. We fell from perfection. We don't even have that choice. That choice was already made for us back in the garden. There is no opportunity for us to live a sin-free life. A human being in and of themselves, born after the fall, cannot do that. Pelagius, he didn't like that idea. He went against it. He said, no, you have free will. And for him, it was a cop-out to say that you're already guilty of this. You don't have a choice in the matter. For him, that didn't make sense, because then why could you even punish somebody for that? They didn't do anything. His thinking was, yes, you come into the world, you have complete freedom. You're just like Adam and Eve were before the fall. But at some point, you choose to sin. There's not anything that you already are hindered by at birth, other than just that we live in a sinful world. You make the decision yourself. It's all on you. You freely choose to sin. And the other flip side of that is you could freely choose not to sin. You can overcome sin by the power of the will. And then that leads to salvation. So you can see that that's pretty problematic, what Pelagius is saying. He's taken to this idea of the balance between the sovereignty of God and the free will of human beings to way over to just one side of this. He's not anywhere near the middle, and he's certainly not on the sovereignty of God's side. He's on the human free will side in a big way. Augustine disagreed with this. He said that was not correct. He believed that there are times when the will is powerless against the hold sin has on it. We have to understand this about Augustine. He had this struggle in his life between the time that he left his family that were Christians behind and went his own way to his conversion. And during that time, he struggled through what was correct. He went through different religious groups. He went through different philosophical groups. He became a person devoted to rhetoric and classical philosophy. But all through that, he was learning more and more about the validity of Christianity, and eventually came to the place where he knew Christianity was correct, and he knew he needed to be a Christian, but yet he wasn't doing it. And so in his mind, he both willed to be a follower of Christ and also willed not to. There was the will was battling within him. He had the will for both. And so for him, he saw this differently, because in his experience, he wanted to do something, but he couldn't do it. He wanted to become a follower of Christ, but he couldn't do it. He felt powerless, and he agonized over this for a long time until finally God broke through in his life, and he did come to Christianity. So he's looking at this through the lens of his own experience. Now, that can be a good thing and a bad thing, because remember, we don't all have the same experiences. Scripture is what rules theology, or it should be. Our own experiences, although they're definitely valid for us and they're definitely things to consider, that doesn't mean that you base all your theology on it. Now, I'm not telling you I disagree with Augustine's thinking here, but I am telling you that he was very heavily influenced by his own struggle, and particularly when it comes to conversion. So what we're going to see going forward with the ideas that Augustine has, we need to just remember that they are colored very much by his own experiences. So what Augustine taught was that the power of sin is such that it takes hold of our will, demonstrating the powerlessness of our will against itself. The sinner can will nothing but sin. So Augustine is teaching what we would all probably consider to be traditional church theology, that a human being born into this world ultimately doesn't have the power to choose not to sin. The sinner is still free to choose between various alternatives, but all of these are sin. So in one sense, the sinner has free will, but he has free will within the context of this idea that he doesn't have the choice to cease sinning. That is one alternative that you don't have. Now, you can choose other things. You can choose what sins you do. You can choose, maybe you have some strength of will over how much you do it, or if you become some kind of an addict, if you break the addiction. There are things within that you can choose, but you can't make the choice to cease sinning. You can do everything you want to do. You can get it down to the bare minimum as you want, but you're not going to be able to just stop. We're all going to continue sinning in this world until something changes that, which is what Augustine would believe happens at conversion. So before the fall, human beings were free to sin and not to sin. So this is the condition that Adam and Eve had before the fall. That condition is what Pelagius says we all have right off the bat. Every one of us, even since the fall. Augustine says it was only for Adam and Eve before the fall until conversion. So let's look at that. Between the fall and redemption, the only freedom is freedom to sin. You're freely able to choose what kind of sin you do, how often you do it, those kind of things. You have some, I say freely, but you have some choice there, but you don't have the freedom to not sin. We lost that at the fall. But after redemption, we're free to sin and not to sin. So we're back in that state. For Augustine, he would say, okay, well, you're back now to where we were before the fall, but not completely, because you're living now in a world that's very tainted by sin. It's a bad world. It's not like the world that Adam and Eve had. So some big disadvantages, but still, you now do have the capacity not to sin. You have that ability because of conversion. All of these conditions for Augustine would be that you still had some freedom of choice. There was still free will involved, but it's freedom determined by influences that are both because of your will and outside of your will. And even in this state, you're now back to the way Adam and Eve were, where you can choose one or the other, but you're very heavily influenced. And then finally, in heaven, there you will have free will, but your free will be only freedom not to sin. So Augustine's always going to be a proponent for free will, but he definitely has some stipulations in there and did not go with what the Pelagians said about this. As for conversion, and this is the one that really probably hits home the most today, only the power of grace itself allows humans the ability to accept grace. The initiative in conversion is all divine. God's grace is irresistible, and God gives it to those who have been predestined to it. So if you're a student of theology, or if you know church theology very well, you probably recognize this type of thinking as being very strongly involved in the Protestant Reformation. And we even say today that those who would hold these particular tenets, along with a lot of other ones as well, would be what we call Reformed. And definitely that is the slant that the Reformed would take, is this thought that Augustine had about God's will being above our own, that our conversion is totally divine. It has nothing to do with human being free will whatsoever. It's all God. He's the one who initiates it. He's the one that allows it to happen, and that you can't even resist it. God's grace is irresistible. Once he comes for you, you're going with him. It doesn't matter. And then finally, there are those who are predestined for it and not, and God gives it to those who are predestined. Very much along the Reformed theological thinking we have today. So you can see very, very heavily influenced. And Protestant theology in general is very heavily influenced by Augustine. Catholic theology is too. We'll see that as we go through this. But you can see here that this idea has become very prominent in the Protestant church among many, but we also see that it was not necessarily always in existence, and we'll actually see that now. So there was controversy, but this controversy with Pelagius and his followers lasted several years, but eventually Pelagianism was rejected by the church. It was cast out. It was too much all about what man did and nothing about God. It was just too much free will. It didn't fit along with what the church had taught in the past. And so it got rejected. But that didn't mean that Augustine's views were widely accepted. In fact, it was the opposite of that. Augustine was accused of being an innovator. Understand this, the thinking that Augustine is bringing into line here about free will, the will of human beings, the sovereignty of God in every way when it comes to conversion, when it comes to being irresistible to a human being to even choose or not to choose. When it comes to this line of thinking, that was not something that existed in church theology to that point in this way. And remember, one of the big reasons for the validity of their teaching over other heretical ideas was that there was a line of secession from the teachings of the apostles that they directly gave to their direct disciples that they had gotten from Jesus, and it had come all the way down this line through the church, and it was therefore the church had the teachings. They had the original teachings. Well, if you then go in and start throwing in some new stuff that wasn't a part of that, well, you got a problem now, because, well, hang on, we're going along with what had always been passed down, and now we're kind of thinking of it in a different way. Does that mean then now that we're just like these other groups that we've criticized because we're looking at it in a different light and maybe even making some changes? And so there were people that were very leery of this idea. They didn't like it. And Augustine was accused of being an innovator. In our world today, that was a compliment. For them, for very traditional people that were traditionalists in the church, being an innovator was not a compliment. It was an insult. And they did not like it one bit. And Augustine dealt with some heavy controversy as a result of that. In fact, there was a guy, Vincent of Léron, who was in France. He argued that Christians should only believe what has been held always, everywhere, and by all. His thinking on this and what he said was the traditional teachings of the church. You can't go outside of those. There's not something new now to come along that's all of a sudden going to be good, because if it was, it would have already happened. We would have gotten it originally. You come along and start giving a whole lot of different thinking and different teachings and different ways of looking at this, and there's a problem right away. And so there were very many people in the church that agreed with this idea from Vincent, that this was not a good thing and that these ideas should be resisted. Many contested Augustine's view that the beginning of faith was in God's action alone rather than in a human decision. You can tell from this that this was not the teaching that had been passed down. It was more of a blend of these ideas, and definitely had a lot to do with the centrality of humans making a choice to be a follower of Jesus Christ. Now with Augustine, he seems to be saying that you don't have that choice. You can make that choice if you wanted to. The only way you can even do it is if God gives you the ability to do it. So there are people that rejected this. And the ones that rejected Augustine's doctrine of predestination were called semi-Pelagians. That's not a really good term for them. They were not saying the same thing as Pelagius was saying. But because of this controversy already being out there, they just got stuck with this name. Now, through a process taking almost a century, Augustine was reinterpreted. Theologians came to label themselves Augustinian while rejecting his views on irresistible grace and predestination. So theologians that came after Augustine, they liked much of what he had to say. Obviously, his theological thinking was very prominent in the church, and they would say that they were followers of him, and yet they kind of downplayed or pushed to the back burner or even tried to reinterpret in some ways his ideas about this irresistible grace of predestination. So even some of the ones that come immediately after him, even almost a century later, they changed around the way he thought about things just to fit what they liked and still be able to say that they were in his line of thinking. And in fact, in 529, the Synod of Orange upheld Augustine's doctrine of the primacy of grace and salvation, but left out the more radical consequences of his doctrine. So they agreed with him that definitely God being the one who initiates things and offers the grace and comes and breaks into the life of a person, they agreed with that. But they downplayed the idea about people not having any choice in that matter and it being irresistible, and that you had those predestined to come into God and they were the only ones who could. That part was kind of left out, but they didn't go against what Augustine was saying. They agreed with him as long as we kind of, well, let's just not really emphasize that other stuff because we don't like it. Think about this. We still are dealing with this now. From early in Christian history, this is a tough subject, and it's not going to always be easy to take one side or the other and then just throw everything else out that you don't like. We strive to know the truth, and we strive to be better, and we strive to understand more clearly, but we'll never attain perfect knowledge on this side of eternity. And so it's okay for us to say to somebody else, you know what, we don't agree, but that's all right. We can be brothers and sisters, and I don't have to try to kick you until you say that what I say is correct. There are a couple of other writings that we need to focus on when it comes to Augustine. They're very important. One was his Confessions. That was a significant work because it was a spiritual autobiography which tells how Augustine was led by God to faith through a long and painful journey. This was his story. This is the reason we have all this information that we do about his journey to conversion. Augustine actually wrote it down, and he told us the truth. I mean, he was very open with what he went through and the mistakes he made and how his thinking had to change and what had to change in his life to ultimately come to the correct place. It's unique in that because there is not a work in this genre throughout all of ancient literature that compares to what Augustine wrote in his Confessions. Ultimately, it witnesses to Augustine's profound psychological and intellectual insight. So this is a very important work. In fact, if you know anything of Augustine's works, it's probably going to be this one, Confessions. But if it's not this one, or if you know two, then it'll be the next one we're going to talk about next. But Confessions is a good read. I've got it in my library. If you've never read it before, I encourage you to do it. It's not super, super long, and it really can help you to gain some insight about somebody who struggled through coming to a place of faith. And then once that happened, God used him in a mighty way. And so the next one is called The City of God. You may have heard of this one. I actually read this in seminary. It's a long read. I'm not trying to turn anybody off from reading it if you like it, but just understand what you're about to bite into, something that you may have some problem chewing. And be careful about that if you want to read it. But I'm not discouraging you from reading it. I know when I picked it as a book that I needed to read to write a paper, I regretted it pretty quickly after that. So this is called The City of God. Augustine wrote this book upon the occasion of the fall of Rome in AD 410. The reason for that is there were still a lot of pagans around, and they were, of course, not very happy that Rome fell. And they started thinking, again, this blame game came against the Christians all the time, especially early on. Anything bad happened to Rome, it was the Christians' fault. Well, these people thought the same way. They thought because so many people that were part of the Roman Empire had left the ancient gods, left behind this paganism to turn to Christianity, that the ancient gods were punishing Rome, and that's the reason that Rome fell. So Augustine wrote The City of God as a response to those allegations. And in that book, Augustine presents a vast history in which he claims there are two cities. So throughout all of human history, Augustine's saying there's basically two kingdoms, two cities. And each one is built on love as a foundation. The city of God is built on the love of God. And the earthly city, the earthly kingdom, is built on love of self. And so throughout human history, these two cities always appear mingled with each other. But in spite of this, there is an irreconcilable opposition between them, a war to the death. Because one is built on love and devotion to God, and one is built on love and devotion to humanity and to the self. And so they can never be at peace. And as a result, throughout history, kingdoms and nations will wither and pass away, but the city of God will always remain. The kingdom of God is always there. It never goes away. All the other nations of the world, they rise, they fall, they come, they go. It happens to everyone. But the kingdom of God stays regardless. And so God allowed Rome to flourish as a means for the spread of the gospel. What Augustine's arguing here is that God knew that because of what the Roman Empire had done in conquering the known world and making travel easy around the world, bringing a common language to much of the world, that Rome would be the perfect government to facilitate the spread of the gospel. But now that that purpose was fulfilled, Rome had sinned plenty to not deserve to continue on. And so Rome had the same fall that all human kingdoms do. And so for Augustine, it was not unusual that Rome would fall. It was to be predicted. And if you look at history, he's right. I mean, even if you want to take this part out about the city of God, earthly nations come and go, and they basically follow about the same pattern. And also within them, they contain people that think that their mighty nation will never end. The people that he wrote this in reply to were probably not real crazy about what he had to say about their empire. They didn't like it. But Augustine, that was what he believed, and he didn't back down from it. So these are two very, very influential writings of Augustine. So what conclusions can we draw to Augustine's life? Augustine was the last great leader of the imperial church in the West. This imperial church time in the West is over with. His works were not forgotten, though, among the ruins of a fallen civilization. Augustine's writings became the teacher of the New Age. So the New Age that's about to begin is going to be very heavily influenced by Augustine's writings. They're going to have his writings, and they're going to be a huge influence on the theological, even the cultural and social thinking of the day. So Augustine's work is only going to become more prominent after his time on earth has passed. Throughout the Middle Ages, no theologian was quoted more often than he was, making him one of the great theologians of the Roman Catholic Church, absolutely. But not only that, Augustine was also a favorite of the Protestant reformers of the 16th century. So Augustine has become the most influential theologian of the Western Church, both for Protestants and for Catholics. And we haven't even scratched the surface of the things we've talked about in this over the 2 weeks we've done this. It's pretty amazing how much this guy has influenced our thinking. in a lot of ways and still does, and people don't even really realize that he does. So now we've come to the end of an era. The imperial church in the West has ended. At the time of the death of Augustine, the Vandals were besieging the city of Hippo, where he was. They soon took the northern coast of Africa except Egypt. So the area that Augustine lived in, that he was bishop of, it's no longer the Roman Empire. It's now been taken over by the Vandals. Rome had already been taken by the Goths in AD 410, so the Western Roman Empire had come to an end at this point. It didn't exist anymore. The imperial church continued existing for another 1,000 years in the Byzantine Empire of the East, but it had come to an end in the West. Eventually, 1,000 years later, it would come to an end in the East as well. But it's now going to begin a new era. And it was going to be a long time before Western Europe would experience political unity and relative peace as was known under Roman rule. Things are about to get very choppy, and it's going to be a wild ride through this next era. It would be centuries before much that had been destroyed was rebuilt. That included roads, buildings, the aqueducts. Not only that, though, literature, art, and knowledge of the physical world, that's all about to be a thing of the past during this time. And it's going to take a long time just to get back to where they were now as they go through this next period of history. So things are about to change in a radical way. The church, in a lot of ways, filled the void left by the empire. And the church came to really fill the power vacuum left by the demise of the empire as well. It is during this time that the church gains the power in government and in ruling the state in an unprecedented way and becomes very, very powerful. People were relying on the church because so much of what they had that made the world work was gone now. And because of that, the church just gained a big influence, but it also gained a lot of power. And that was not necessarily a good thing. We're going to look and see this. There's a saying that power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely, and it's true in the church as well. We're going to see a lot of corruption. We're going to see a lot of problems, and those things, along with the seeds that have been planted throughout this imperial church age, are going to finally give rise to the Protestant Reformation. There was also much work to be done. Some of the invaders were pagan, and the church did not resist reaching out to these people that had come in and conquered their nation. They wanted to teach the Christian faith to their conquerors, and they did. The invaders slowly accepted the Christian faith, and it's from their ranks that came the new generation of leaders of the church. It's going to be from this group that came in and conquered the Western Roman Empire that are going to eventually rise up to be the next generation of leadership and influence within the church. Most of the invaders who were already Christians were Arian due to missionary efforts among the Goths during the high point of Arianism. So there were a lot of these invaders who were already Christians, actually, that came in, but they were Arian. And in the Western church, the western part of the Roman Empire, Arianism was dead. It had been dealt with. Well, now that these guys have come in and taken over, it is back. This meant that the Arian controversy once again came to the foreground in the West. And so now we're going to have to deal with Arianism once again. So next week, when we jump into the next part of the history of Christianity, we're going to be starting our third major era of Christian history, and that is medieval Christianity. So we've moved from the early church to the imperial church. Now with the fall of the empire, we're going to be jumping into medieval Christianity, and I'm telling you, buckle up and get ready, because there's some crazy stuff coming, and you're going to start to see the problems boil up in ways that up until this point we just have seen a little bit. We're going to see majorly as we go through this period of time, and it's going to become like a pot boiling, steam rising, and pressure coming to the point that lid's is going to blow off. And that's going to happen at the Protestant Reformation, but this period of time leads directly into that. So I think you're going to really get a lot out of this next section to understand some of the crazy stuff that went on and how we got to where we are and brought in the Protestant Reformation and the corruption in the church that came, and why that had to be answered. So we'll begin that next week. Thanks for joining me today. I'm so glad to be able to present this history to you. Hope that you will be blessed by it and definitely hope that God will be with you this week and you'll have a blessed week, and hope to be able to talk with you again next week. Hope that you can be a part of that time. God bless.